Welcome to POLSIS Research and Profile. My name is Andrew Phillips and I'm joined today by my friend and colleague, Associate Professor Shahar Hameiri, talking about his latest book, International Intervention in Local Politics, co-authored with Carolyn Hughes and Fabio Scarpello. Shahar, welcome to Research and Profile.
Thank you.
So first things first, what is it that motivated you and your co-authors to write this book?
Let me try and think. It was quite a while ago. If I remember correctly, what got us into it was in response to very significant changes in the literature on international state-building interventions around the time we were working on the project. So if you go back to the early 1990s and maybe even the early 2000s, the literature on international intervention at that point, which was growing quite large, was focused on what interveners want to do, what they're trying to do. Then another wave of scholarship came in and essentially said, well, to be honest, they're not actually achieving their objectives very well at all. A third wave then looked at how and why. And the focus of this literature was on the interface between the international interveners and the recipients of intervention, which seems pretty logical when you think about it. Now, there are two bodies of literature that we look at in the book that essentially developed in complete isolation from each other. The first was in international relations, and especially the focus on peace building within international relations. And the second one was in development studies, especially the so-called political economy turn in development studies. And both of those bodies of literature essentially looked at the same problem, but we think they didn't do it well enough. And we wanted to try and push them a little bit to go beyond where they're going with our focus on the politics of scale.
Yeah, I'd like to talk to you about the politics of scale in a moment, but just first to give it some sort of local context and flavour. Obviously there's a huge awareness in Australia of the so-called arc of instability, although I know that many people cringe at that phrase. But people often talk about the Ramsay mission, the regional assistance mission to the Solomon Islands, as being a real local success story in terms of state building. Your book suggests that the story is a little bit more complicated than that.
Yeah, it's not necessarily the story that the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade would like to hear, but by now the view that the intervention was not as successful as it was initially touted to be is not entirely unique. There's been a number of large-scale assessments of the mission, some of them relatively formal, associated with the Pacific Islands Forum, and they've all found that the mission had some successes and some failures. I guess what we do in our book is to try and explain where the successes came and where the failures came. And our focus essentially is on what how the different parts of the intervention affected the interests of Solomon Islands national elite. What we found is that the national elite in Solomon Islands, when its interests were advanced by intervention, the outcomes were remarkably successful. And the best example for that is the case of state expenditure, which quadrupled under Ramsay in a very short time. Anyone would agree that's a remarkable success.
Yeah,
tax receipts just went through the roof. But what happened with that money, that's a different story.
Right.
If we look at expenditure, we find that most of the essential services are still funded by donors. And the incredible increase in government capacity brought by this increase in revenue was used in the form of so-called constituency development funds by members of parliament to secure their re-election by basically funding support bases in their localities. And it was also used as a way of pushing back on the decentralization agenda, which is very popular in Solomon Islands, but not with the national elites.
Right, and so you use this idea of a politics of scale in order to kind of cut through this complexity and make sense of this really interesting kind of pattern of coalition building. I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit to that theoretical perspective. And what is it that the politics of scale approach really gives us in terms of analytical purchase?
So in development studies, the political economy turn was already looking at the role of domestic elites and how they shape the outcomes of intervention. What are their interests, what are their ideologies, and how these things then interface with the intervention. But it sees the dynamics of what happens domestically and the interveners as essentially separate domains. The hybridity scholarship that I mentioned from peace building, which has grown tremendously over the last few years, does recognize there's some kind of scalar dynamic. You have the international intervention, then you have the local recipients, and looks at the interface between the two of them. But we think it does that a bit crudely. Essentially, it understands the interveners, the internationals, and the locals, the recipients, as distinct, as separate, as having different normative ideas about social and political order, as wanting different forms of governance and peace. We don't think that is entirely correct. So the politics of scale approach essentially emerges in the gap that is opened by these, if you like, blind sides of these different approaches or wider literatures that have emerged. And what we look at there essentially starts off from the premise that this whole business of international intervention is now occurring in a context of sovereign states. This is not, if you like, the era of empire where formal sovereignty is usurped. And what that means in practice is that interveners, what they're trying to do is not take over sovereignty, they're trying to change how the state operates from the inside, how different parts of the bureaucracy function. So the way they do that is to target particular parts of the administration in various ways, usually through the form of secondments or additional funding and various forms of monitoring, to change how they operate so that they no longer respond to domestic popular or political pressures, but essentially are geared towards international agendas and objectives. Okay, so we call that the scalar strategy of internationalization. But that receives a response from the recipients of intervention. Crucial for us is the agency of the national elites, the people that are in charge of the government, basically, in those countries. And again, that goes back to the point about sovereign states. The governments of sovereign states have power. They can push back if they want on either the entire intervention or in certain aspects of the intervention. So the scalar strategy of total rejection, which is one that we identify in the book, is quite rare, but it could happen.
Okay. I mean, that's one of the things I find fascinating with it. Can you tell us some other strategies? If you've got that as one, what are some of the others?
The more common one, which we focus most of our attention on, is what we call selective adoption.
Okay.
And that is where the elites dominating the national government, what they try to do is pick out aspects of the intervention that support their interests, their normative preferences, but also sometimes are just disadvantageous to their rivals or supportive of their allies. And they try to advance those while pushing back on aspects of the intervention that are contrary to their interests. And this is partly why you get really uneven outcomes in intervention, because different aspects of the intervention affects in different ways those elites and other social and political groups in recipient societies. A final strategy that we look at, which is, if you like, the strategy of the weak, is what we call localization. And that is where groups essentially try to push authority, decision-making, resources in many cases down to a subnational level. That could be a subnational level defined as an administrative unit of the state, but in many cases it's not. In many cases it's framed in terms of more organic communities, like a tribe, a clan, or some other local community. And it's how these different scalar strategies interact with each other and with the relative power of the different groups involved that shapes the outcomes of intervention.
Yeah, I mean, theoretically it's a fascinating book, but you've also done some remarkable empirical research in this. And the thing that I've really enjoyed about it is there's a great degree of practical relevance of the book as well. So a final question in that practical vein, given that Australia is likely to be committed to state-building endeavours internationally for quite some time to come, what would be the big policy takeaway from the book that you would offer the Australian Foreign Minister, for example?
Well, the first one would be to put me in a very handsome retainer.
That's very reasonable.
Probably for about 5 to 10 years.
Okay.
But assuming that won't happen, unless the minister happens to be listening now to our conversation, who knows? Well, the other thing that I would say is to try and break down the objectives of intervention and to think a little bit more tactically, not just strategically, about what intervention is meant to achieve. As I mentioned before, national elites may have different views and may be fragmented in terms of how they interact with different parts of the intervention. But generally how interventions are framed tends to be in terms of lofty and grandiose objectives like good governance, ridding countries of corruption or whatever that may be, and that very rarely succeeds. So we distinguish between tactical and strategic alliances. Strategic alliances are with people we really like because they basically want to do the same thing that we want to do, which is, in that case, achieving those good governance outcomes. That's great. But in many cases, especially the ones we look at, these people are just not very powerful. They tend to be middle-class NGOs and the like, and although they're very well-meaning, often they have great ideas, they very rarely have the capacity to actually advance any of those goals in a meaningful way. So what we recommend is actually to conduct a serious analysis that identifies who are the powerful actors, what are their interests, and then try and form alliances with what we call tactical alliances with those actors towards advancing very specific, limited and clear goals where there are shared interests between the interveners and those tactical allies. These tactical allies are the powerful ones. In many cases, we don't like them very much because they have unsavory dimensions to what they do. but we need them in order to advance particular outcomes. So go for those alliances, go for those relationships. They can actually advance at least some parts of what you're trying to achieve. It's very difficult to get everything.
Right. So secret to success in life then is low expectations, is what I'm taking out of it.
Well, my secret to success is to set the bar very low,
Okay.
and then I'm never disappointed.
Well, you're certainly not disappointed in this book. It is a really terrific achievement. So congratulations to you and your co-authors, and thanks so much for joining us in Research and Profile.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks.